This lecture is going to look at the rise of Joseph Stalin and his control over what becomes the Soviet Union. In order to understand what I'm talking about here in this lecture, you should make sure that you read over the Hunt textbook and look at the material on the Russian Revolution and the rise of Lenin, as well as the Russian Civil War. Um, in order to see how Stalin comes to power and how we get to a Stalinist Russia, a lot of this revolves around the death of Lenin in 1924, and also is connected to the friendship that Lenin had with Leon Trotsky, who you see in the bottom left corner there. So bottom left is Trotsky, bottom right is the corpse of Lenin, and of course in the top right is Joseph Stalin. Trotsky was one of the original Bolshevik revolutionaries and Marxist theorists that worked with Lenin and very much represented sort of a left branch of the Communist Party. He had a lot of important political and military posts during Lenin's rule. I mean, in charge of foreign affairs, leader of the Red Army, Commissar of War. So he was a very, very important figure. But what happens is that after Lenin's death, because of his work behind the scenes, Joseph Stalin is actually able to come to power. Joseph Stalin actually has a pretty inauspicious beginning. He was a member of the Central Committee that led the Bolshevik Revolution, but he was a very, very minor player in that. He became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in 1922, 2 years before Lenin's death, a position that was fairly insignificant. Earned him the nickname Comrade Index Card because basically he just filed things. But he used it to build up a source of his power base, and he had great influence on who could actually join the party, and he ended up filling it with his allies. So over the course of several years prior to Lenin's death, he was able to essentially stack the deck in his favor so that there were all sorts of his own supporters. And so Stalin himself, there you have his dates, 1879 to 1953, Stalin was able to turn his control, his seemingly insignificant control, to his advantage. And one of the ways that he did this was to essentially establish a cult of Lenin at the time. And what this said was, in part, that Lenin was essentially this revered figure of the communist revolution, or the Russian Revolution, and essentially a saint, and nothing that he said could be contradicted. Unfortunately for Stalin, that meant a bit of a problem. And that bit of a problem was that Lenin had actually written a will. And in that will, he had apparently feared the power and violence of Stalin even at this early stage, and he recommended in his will that Stalin be bypassed for roles of leadership. Actually, what it said in there was essentially never let Stalin get the reins of power. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And so what Stalin was able to do is after Lenin's death, Stalin had already had pretty much enough power that he could do what he wanted. He was able to ostracize certain members of the party and eventually opposed Trotsky, who was one of the main men involved with the revolution, and actually got Trotsky, essentially Trotsky had to flee the country, and ultimately he's assassinated by Stalin's men. So even though Lenin had said, do not let Stalin come to power, it was like his one main thing, just not Stalin. That ultimately failed, but because Stalin had this control behind the scenes. So Leon Trotsky is out, Stalin is in, and Stalin has put people into a position of power where he is able to establish his totalitarian system of government, which is what we'll see here, and we'll also see in Nazi Germany. This is a system where where the state has absolute control over every aspect of life, public and private, and government will use a variety of tools to make sure dissent is quashed and only official ideologies are followed. This will include propaganda, secret police, terror, unity around a perceived enemy. And it's not just in the Soviet Union. It'll be fascism in Germany and Italy. You can see it in Japan as well. Here's some examples, actually, of some propaganda that is used by Stalin. What this image you see here, the top it says GPU, and down below it says, in part, it says counter-revolutionary wrecker, revolutionary lightning. And what this is supposed to mean is that the counter-revolutionary wrecker is this evil green individual there who, surprisingly or maybe not, looks exactly like or very much like Leon Trotsky. So this is a person who's sort of reaching up, he's a counter-revolutionary, right? Uh, he is someone who is going to destroy all of the gains of the Communist Party. So the GPU is the counter-revolutionary wrecker. They're the ones who ruin those individuals, and apparently by striking them with lightning. It's not the most evolved image, but it is an idea that the GPU is going to stop these individuals and restore, or at least maintain, the revolution. To give you a sense of what the GPU is, I have this chart on the side there. At the beginning of the Russian Revolution, Lenin and the other Bolsheviks end up employing or creating what is known as the Cheka. The Cheka is the secret police, and it basically evolves into these various forms, but they're all sort of one and the same. First, it's the Cheka, it evolves into the GPU, it then becomes the NKVD, and it's most memorably known as the KGB. So those are sort of its legacies over the period from the basically 1920s all the way up to the 90s and the end of the Soviet Union. But here's a form of propaganda then that shows that there are people who are trying to stop the revolution, and the secret police will take care of that. Here's another not so subtle image, which basically essentially is Stalin in a red worker's jumpsuit, in his hand holding what is another sort of vile image of Trotsky himself. At the top it says, "Destroy the vermin." He's obviously supposed to be something rat-like. At the bottom it says, "Wipe from the face of the earth Trotsky and his bloodthirsty gang of fascists." So even though Trotsky was involved with the communist revolution, he's now being put in the hands of, or in the camp of the fascists. All these papers that Trotsky has in his hands, one of them is terrorist acts against the leaders of the party and the government. Another one is mass murders of workers. Another is explosion and arsonism at factories and mines, train wrecks. Another one just simply says fascism. Conspiring with foreign counter-spy agencies, war. High treason, auctioning off the USSR. Restoration of capitalism. Espionage and acts of sabotage. All of these things here are things that they were accusing the enemies of the revolution of doing, and then he's simply just describing them to Trotsky. And so, by having state control over media and propaganda and all these forms of propaganda, Stalin was able to control the narrative. By the way, you should notice too that Trotsky here also has two different boots on. One is a black tall jackboot with the swastika on it, so he's apparently working with the Nazis. And the other is a white boot with a spur on it, which obviously is something that cowboys use, and that would be a reference to the Americans, the capitalists. So apparently Trotsky's working with them all. Now, there are other examples and ways in which Stalin uses propaganda to solidify his control and his message, and one of those is manipulation of images. Here's a very famous picture of Lenin giving a speech. So Lenin is the one who has the hat in his hand. He's in the suit on the top of the podium there, really speaking to this mass of people that are gathered there. To the right of him, facing the camera, wearing a uniform, is Leon Trotsky. So remember, Leon Trotsky is Lenin's right-hand man. So Stalin has to try to do something. If he's his right-hand man, how do you convince the people that Trotsky is a problem? Well, you can't show him with Lenin because then it just lends him support. So the easiest way to do it is simply crop him out. Right? So any pictures that might show these events I just did a simple crop on this one here, but I'll show you what Stalin actually does. So an easiest way is to do it. You could crop that, but that doesn't make it look all that convincing because it's only part of the picture. You could still use it, but here is a better example of what happens. So you can see in this image here, you have the same picture. You have Lenin speaking, and if you look to the side, you see two individuals there, one taller than the other. The lower one down is Trotsky. And all Stalin simply does is a very crude version of Photoshop, and basically just blacks out the individual who is there. That's it. They're gone. Out of the picture. So Trotsky no longer exists. He's written out of history. So now he can, Stalin can publish pictures of Lenin and have no Trotsky in them at all whatsoever. So early manipulation of photography for propaganda purposes. You see the same thing happening here. Once again, there's Trotsky. So you have Lenin in the center there, because you can see him, he's in the second picture as well. And then he's standing right next to Trotsky, who apparently is waving or saluting, and then Trotsky's gone in the other picture. He's just simply out of the picture. So is the person who is between the two of them, as well as an individual, the second one over from the right in your picture that's on the left. The second one over from the bottom right, that man is taken out, as well as the one who was between Trotsky and Lenin. But just remove them. And then anything that publishes these pictures then has them in it. And these are easy ways for them to do that, to get rid of people. Just literally write them out of history, taking them out of history books, taking them out of photos. And this also meant that you had to remove all of those books as well. And it turned into some fairly ridiculous hunts by the secret police. An example of punishing a dissident who supposedly supported Trotsky. There was an execution of a 70-year-old school teacher who still had a book that had a picture of Trotsky in it. There was an old man who accidentally had a picture of Trotsky up and ran into trouble as well. So just simply having those things, Stalin tried to purge them so that there was no reference. The idea was to make a direct connection between Lenin and Stalin and no intermediaries. Get Trotsky out of the picture and then ultimately just have him assassinated. Now, by the way, it also wasn't just Trotsky that this happened to as well. Stalin had a lot of people disappeared, quite literally. Here's Nikolai Yevtsov, who is chief of the Soviet secret police. So if the chief of the Soviet secret police can be disappeared, nobody is safe. So you have the original picture on the left, and there is Yevtsov, who is sort of leaning next to him by the river, and then Yevtsov is gone. So they can be easily disappeared. All right, so that's one aspect of propaganda. We're going to look at more in a second. But I want to talk about what Stalin's plans are and how he ends up essentially controlling the USSR and essentially modernizing it. Basically what he did is he pushed for rapid industrialization through, and what you see in your readings, using these 5-year plans, these 5-year production quotas. So in 5 years we're going to accomplish the following goals. And he begins these from 1928 on. His idea was that if the USSR did not fully industrialize soon, they'd never catch up to the rest of Europe. And so really between 1928 and at least until 1955, he called for rapid state-led industrialization. And it also meant, as we'll see, the forced collectivization of rural property to meet these goals. This requires direct central economic planning, and the easiest way to do that is to essentially have the state control everything. It meant rapid industrialization then, which meant they had to produce more coal, iron, and other natural goods that you need for industrialization. You have to create electricity. Each time the government sets very high goals, demands production increases. So, for example, Stalin claimed that output was increased to 400% by 1940. So each time you put out one of these plans, the government sets a goal. They demand production to increase at least 100%, often up to 300%. They use the spirit of competition of workers to fulfill these goals. So here's an example. Supposedly in 1935, there was a miner named Stakhanov who mined 14 times his daily quota and became a national hero that others can emulate. So many times these goals were achieved, but it did take its toll on the workers because the quotas were so high, wages were low, and they're often using forced labor from prison inmates who they needed more prison inmates, so they often just put people in prison. Or those who were accused of trying to sabotage any of these plans and not work well were themselves imprisoned. One of the many examples of this perceived enemy was that if production goals fell short, it was not the fault of the government, but of enemies trying to sabotage the revolution. And this isn't just top down, though. You had a lot of people who were willingly working for this goal in order to industrialize the state. There is this question of productivity numbers. Did Stalin really reach these levels or not? And probably in some cases not. I mean, they did industrialize rapidly, and that is one of the things that helped them in their success over the Germans in World War II. So yes, Stalin manipulated the figures, but they did succeed and industrialize very rapidly. Maybe not as well as they said. Stalin also said that there was a constant struggle to achieve utopia. that it was going to be hard work and people needed to make sacrifices in order for this to happen.